Good evening. Today we're going to be looking at how to elevate our synths to that next level. We're not going to be doing anything drastic to the sounds itself, but we are going to be breathing life into the lifeless and hope into the hopeless. We're going to be looking at how to create movement in our sounds so they feel less static, and just how to make them generally more pleasing to our ears and feel more hooky and more natural. So we're going to go from a sound that's super simple like this to this. Let's get into it. Right, so before we get into anything, I'm just going to break down what's happening melodically in this song. So we're in A sharp minor, and the bass is going from A flat to G flat to E flat to E. So that's a 1, 7, 5, 6 progression. So now that gives us a little bit of context as to what the lead is doing. So while the bass has its full cycle going over this amount of time, the lead cycle is effectively going half that amount of time. So we can see that there's a call and response going from this half to this half, and they're doing a very similar thing, but the melody is just changing slightly. So the first half of our melody, the foundation is playing the third to the fifth, a lower octave down, and the second of the scale. And then our second half is playing the second to the seventh to the root note. So there we get the foundation for our melody. So if I just put those little melody flicks in there as well, so this B and this B sharp. Now we can see that it's actually a super simple melody. And I was almost reticent to break it down in this way because it's not a copy and paste system where you can just do this exact same thing and it will work for your tunes. It will work, but you will have the exact same melody. Fundamentally, it's important to realize that when you're writing a lead like this, it's all about trial and error as to the notes that you end up landing on. It's not a specific science. It's whatever sounds best to your ears. Even though I've broken it down in terms of the numbers, I would actually recommend that you use your ears to write these kind of melodies rather than breaking it down and writing it through numbers. The reason that we break it down into numbers is to understand it retrospectively, but when you're writing them, I'm not sure it's the best idea to write with numbers. It's better to write with your ears and your feelings. So we've got the basis for our melody. How do we enhance it? So one of the amazing things that they've done with this melody is they've made a slight change in the second half. So let's just hear it as it is now, and then we'll make a few tweaks as to how it is on the actual record. So at the moment, the rhythms are exactly the same in this call and response. If we see this as the call and this is the response, they're playing the exact same rhythms. So in the record, what they've done is they've slightly altered the rhythm of the second half. So there we can see the change in the rhythm on this second half really helps to add something different to what you're hearing. So rather than it being the same again and again, you have this one little change in the rhythm, which helps your ear to become less bored and helps kick on the energy a little bit more. So now we've got the basis for our melody. How do we make it even more exciting? So at the moment, we've just got a basic saw wave, and there's a few bits of processing that we can do to just add a little bit more excitement to it. And so one of the first things that I might do is put an LFO on the level of our oscillator. So let's turn that down all the way, and then we can make a shape that's sort of like this. And then put the rate up to 16, set that as trigger. So as before, we've introduced variation in the melody over these 8 bars. Now we've introduced a little bit of variation every time the synth is being played. So we're never getting the same static note being played as we did before. So now let's add a little bit of processing on there. So maybe a little bit of hyperdimension. Just widens it out a little bit, makes it a little bit more interesting. Maybe we can add some compression. And some delay. And again, to make it a little bit more interesting, we can change the rate of the left and the right. So we can have the right at 16ths and the left at 8. and then a little bit of reverb. And then a little bit of distortion, as always. So where we had it before, it was quite dry and wasn't really distinguishing itself from the rest of the track. And now we've added a little bit more processing. It has its own character and exists in its own space. And there's a few more things that we can do to make this sound a little bit more interesting. And one of my go-tos is pitch bend. So at the moment, our melody is being played pretty straight. So we can do some little tweaks to the pitch bend so we can bend into the note and out of the note. So that really subtle pitch bend into the first note just again creates a little bit more movement in the sound. So it's not just this static staccato hit the whole way through. And we can do a similar thing where we go from the B flat to the B to the B flat. We could actually bend that whole note. So if we elongate that all the way, and so because we're only going up one semitone in that pitch bend, I will change this top bend range up to 1. And then we can automate this pitch wheel to go up and then a gradual decrease out of the note. So that just makes it sound that little bit more human and makes it feel like it's being played in with the synth rather than it being inputted into MIDI. And maybe we can do a similar glide in on to this note here. So another way we can add a little bit of variation to our leads is by adding delay throws and reverb throws. So if we use Endless Smile, we can just use a kick of Endless Smile at the end of one of these phrases. So again, it's just adding that little bit of variation as the melody is being played, so it doesn't just sound like the same thing over and over again. And another thing we can do to make it feel less static rhythmically is for it not to sit on the grid for the whole of the melody. So we can just offset these just a little bit, so it just feels a little bit more human. You can do this with a groove, but personally I like to do it with each individual note because you have a little bit more control in that sense. And again, it's a super subtle change, but to the ear, we're used to hearing music that is not on grid. You know, before the invention of computers, nothing was on grid. It was all played by humans. So in our minds, we're used to hearing music that isn't on grid. So when you put it on grid, there's something that doesn't feel quite right to the listener. And by adding these tiny little bits that are offbeat and off grid, just helps it feel that little bit more human. And another thing to do to change up the sound of your melody is to automate bits of your envelope. So let's automate our release. So maybe at the end of this phrase, we can up the release just a little bit to add a little bit more variation. And another one that's really effective would be using the filter. And at the moment, we've not got a filter on, so it's not the best example. But as an example, if we had an envelope on our filter, we could automate the cutoff of the filter. So we open up the cutoff as we're going through the melody. And maybe you could do a similar thing with the drive of the distortion as well. So let's add some little kinks in the drive. And we could literally apply this to any effect. So we could use a phaser, could turn the dry wet all the way down. We could just add some more dry wet to the end of that phrase. So we see the way that we've constructed it at the moment is we have a phaser coming in after 2 bars, and then we have an endless smile coming in after 4 bars. We have a bit of automation at this part of the melody, and then a different part of automation at this part of the melody. So as we're going through, there's always little bits of ear candy that are just changing up the sound as we're progressing through that melody. And there we have it. Very, very simple, tiny little tweaks to your lead can breathe so much life into it, make it sound less static, less like it's been inputted into MIDI. This is the closest we can get to sounding like Mike Dean without actually being a synth genius. There's a reason that his synths particularly sound so good, is because he's inputting them using analog synths with human mistakes. He's not on grid and he's using pitch bends to take the sound to that next level. And these are the kind of techniques that we can use to emulate that kind of sound. I do hope it's helped. Love to your mothers. Thank you.